Hello, YouTubers. You've caught me in the middle of making a pot of coffee to stay awake and sharpen my wits for this next series of videos on Asia between 1450 and 1750 and kind of the response to European invaders. Settle down, coffee pot. Oddly enough, Asia, and Southeast Asia particularly, would become incredibly valuable as a place to grow coffee. So there's our connection there. And the coffee that I'm drinking today is coffee that was basically cultivated first in the Middle East, then grown in Southeast Asia. So there we go. So we're going to look at quite a few terms and a couple of your homework questions as well. So I'll mention those specifically when I get to them. But the terms we're going to look at are the Asia Sea Trading Network, or the Asian Sea Trading Network, then factories, followed by the Dutch Trading Empire, Ceylon, Java, the Philippines, which are three locations, island nations in Indonesia or Southeast Asia. And finally, we'll end with the tribute system. And within there, we're also going to talk about the first few questions from your homework. So let's start with the first term, the Asian Sea Trading Network. So the description of the Asian Sea Trading Network is pretty obvious. It was essentially the network of sea trade that had existed in the Indian Ocean, made up of those three zones that we've talked about so much in class: the Arab zone, the Indian zone, and then the Chinese zone. So what's the big deal about the Asian Sea Trading Network? The network had operated relatively smoothly and peacefully since essentially since the Han Dynasty in China. The classical empires even had used some form of sea trade, and as sea trade began to grow and as the use of the compass and navigational techniques improved on ships, it was fairly peaceful. So think back to when the Muslim empires first began to expand, when Islam first hit the waters of the Indian Ocean, and one of the key factors in spreading Islam to Southeast Asia was trade network, this trade network overseas. So it wasn't dominated by any one force. The same goods from all three of the zones had been traded relatively peacefully up until this time period that we're entering in the introduction of the Europeans. So the Asian Sea Trading Network, you also have a question, a couple of them about this. First, why did the presence of Muslims in the East lead to problems in the trading network particularly, lead to problems for the Portuguese and then later Europeans? Well, essentially, Muslim traders, since they had been operating in the East for a long time, were already deeply entrenched in this trading network, and they had far greater numbers than European Christians. And so this not only made them rivals for trade, but also rivals for religious conversion. And as we've kind of seen throughout this course so far, when very large universalizing religions come to small areas that do not have a universalizing religion yet, they tend to gain converts really quickly. Well, Islam had already gained converts, and so Europeans had a difficult time convincing anybody in this area to embrace Christianity. There was no single dominant force. One of your questions I asked you is, why was there no single dominant force? Why were most of the exchanges peaceful? Well, most of the people involved in the trading network at this time were not working for a very large empire. They were, for the most part, working for either local princes or smaller kingdoms. And so, not being part of a large empire, one of their missions was not to militarily and politically dominate other people. Their primary agenda was making money by trade. And so the exchanges were peaceful because essentially they relied on each other to maintain this balance of trade. And they sailed in lightly armored ships so they could carry more goods and not worry about defending themselves militarily. So it worked out pretty well. And question number 4 asks, why then did the Portuguese decide to use force when they entered the Asian Sea Trading Network? Why couldn't they just be peaceful? What was their plan to gain control of the trading network? So essentially they realized that the only thing they really had to offer for trade goods in the Indian Ocean was gold and silver. Not many things that the Europeans were producing at this time were of huge value, and so they knew that basically trading these things would make the Asian kingdoms very strong, because the gold and silver supplies would basically move in one direction to Asia. This was unacceptable to them. So they said basically they wanted to use violence and take what they wanted. And they especially didn't like the idea of handing over a lot of large sums of money to the Muslims in the area. So it was a religious battle as well as an economic battle. So their plan, what did they decide to do, was to take control of the trade goods in Asia that were going to Europe. So in order to do this, they used violence to raid what they saw as key ports and key junctions in the Asia Sea Trading Network, and they were able to gain a few good ports and control without losing any major battles. And essentially they took the Asians and the Muslim empires, or the traders in the area, by surprise, because they had fairly good weaponry on their maneuverable ships, the caravel. So that was kind of the way that the Europeans kind of got into the Asian trading network and started to use violence. So going along with that, our next vocab word is factories. And we think of factories, we think of big smokestacks and manufacturing factories that make something. Factories were fortresses that were built up by the Portuguese and other Europeans so they could store goods for shipment back to Europe. So essentially factories were warehouses for Asian goods and products that they were gaining in Asia. So what? What's the big idea behind these warehouses? Well, essentially they were these strongholds which were heavily guarded, heavily controlled, and they helped Portugal essentially gain more control over trade and dominate trade by stockpiling these items in these factories. So this was a system that they used in order to gain more power. The Dutch came next after the Portuguese, and the Dutch trading empire is the next vocab term that we're going to go over. And it might be the last one because this is running a little bit long, but maybe I'll just make it a 10-minute video and you'll have to bear with me. So, the Dutch trading empire is similar to the Portuguese in that the Dutch essentially attempted to set up factories and ports in order to control trade. So not only were they attempting to invade into the Asian Sea Trading Network, but also they were competing with Portugal. The Dutch became very successful, probably the most successful trade empire in the Indian Ocean, mainly because the Portuguese were not able to hold on to what they had taken. They, in many ways, took a more peaceful approach. They encouraged their company leaders to mingle with the local societies and to become to fraternize with them, basically to become more friendly with them and not attempt to convert them to a specific religion. They realized that that was going to be futile. So they attempted to monopolize certain items, certain products, instead of trying to gain control of everything, and this led to far greater success. So now let's talk about 3 specific locations in the Asian Sea Trading Network. We should be able to do this video in 10 minutes. I think we can. The first one is Ceylon. So Ceylon is an island in the Indian Ocean Trade Network in what is now modern Indonesia, I believe. Part of modern Indonesia. I'd have to look at it, but I'm pretty sure that's true. It was a major source of cinnamon. So that was its big deal. And cinnamon is a spice that could be sold for massive amounts of money back in Europe, so it was an important area, Ceylon was. The Portuguese and the Dutch both attempted to control this island in order to gain a monopoly of the cinnamon trade in East Asia so that they could become far richer when they returned to Europe. So Ceylon, cinnamon. Ceylon, cinnamon. That's easy to remember, right? The next one is Java, and that should essentially tip you off. It's like my favorite island in the whole world, right? I've never been there, but I would love to go. So Java is another island in the Indian Ocean Trade Network. It was a major source of coffee. Once it didn't begin there, but coffee was really suitable for growing there. It was a suitable island for growing coffee. So the Dutch gained control of this island. Java was essentially came under Dutch control, and essentially the Dutch became coffee kings of the trade empire. So Java coffee. That's pretty easy to remember, right? Specific evidence, if that's what we're looking for. The Philippines. What were the Philippines? Philippines are not part of Indonesia, but they are part of Southeast Asian island system. It's an island nation, a series of islands. The two main islands are Luzon and Mindanao. Mindanao. I want to say Mindanao, but I'm probably saying it wrong. It might be Mindanao. Mindanao. I don't speak Tagalog, and so I'm bad at pronunciation. So Spain essentially gained control of the Philippines. If they were named after King Philip II from Spain, so it should kind of make you think of that. But this was like one of Spain's only real holdings in East Asia and the Indian Ocean Trade Network, because essentially they had landed there, tried to conquer most of the people there, gained more success on Luzon, and it fell under Spanish control. So Philippines, think King Philip II, think Spain. That's your tip-off. We didn't do it under 10 minutes, and I've still got one more term, and this term is the tribute system. So the tribute system is similar. Well, it's similar to the encomienda system, but far less brutal. So basically, the tribute system meant that farmers on Asian islands that were controlled by Europeans had to pay a portion of their crops to the Europeans as tribute. So what? The tribute system was way less brutal than outright slavery and much less severe than the encomienda system that was being used in the Americas. Farmers' lives didn't change very much. Sometimes they would just pay tribute, and they were kind of used to paying taxes or tribute to local leaders anyway, so it was essentially a way for the Europeans to make more profit. So hopefully that'll help you out in some of these vocabulary terms, and I think I should switch back and talk about some of the questions that we wanted to gain in mind here. Question number 5, I asked you, what made the Dutch so much different from the Portuguese, the Dutch and the British? What made the Dutch and the British so much different from the Portuguese, and how did they become more successful in the Asian Sea Trade Network? So essentially, they did not use violence very much and factories for control of trade, but they realized that they would become very exhausted if they attempted just to constantly defend and be on guard. Instead, in order to get involved with the peaceful trade network that existed without using brute force, they just focused on certain items or crops instead of trying to control everything. So this made them much more successful because they were just trying to gain control of, maybe monopolize 1 or 2 items, and instead of basically controlling everything, which they realized would be impossible. So. And we just talked about the tribute system, how it was different from the encomienda system, and essentially it was a kinder and gentler form of the encomienda system without the Europeans gaining outright control or ownership of the land. They worked through local leaders in order to gain tribute, and so it was kind of like a tax system that the farmers did not necessarily become ownership. They weren't owned by the Europeans. They just paid tribute to them. And so that was kind of the big difference between those two. All right, this was probably the longest video you've ever watched about the Indian Ocean Trade Network. I'll put a link to another one. Let's put it over here. Bink, right there, and you can check it out. It's the Crash Course World History one on Indian Ocean Trade, which is kind of an exciting one. I like that one. So be awesome and stay tuned. There'll probably be one other video since I went so long on this one and took up so much of your Super Bowl Sunday. Go Seahawks! Be awesome!